You're listening to a podcast from 702 and Cape Talk.
Reedy Cabby on your number one news and talk station.
What if there was a different way of looking at drug addiction? Author and columnist for the Huffington Post and The Independent in London, Johann Hari, has recently completed a 30,000-mile, 3.5-year journey to figure out what really drives the drug war worldwide. And he's got some interesting ideas which he will share with us. Johann joins us on the line from London. He's a journalist and author of Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. Good morning to you and welcome.
Oh, hi, Reedy. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm most fascinated by your journey. Why did you decide to undertake this journey to figure out what really drives the drug war worldwide? How did it unfold?
Well, I decided to start writing my book 4 years ago, really for two reasons. One is I realised we were coming up to 100 years since drugs were first banned in America and Britain, and it was then kind of imposed on the rest of the world. And I thought, this is an issue I've been thinking about really all my life. One of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And as I got older, realising we had drug addiction in my family, which then affected some of my other relatives and other people close to me. And I realised that there were, even though I thought of myself as a pretty well-informed person about this, I realised there were loads of just really basic questions I didn't know the answer to, like, why did we go to war against drug users 100 years ago? Why do we continue when lots of people think it doesn't work? What do the alternatives really look like? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? And as you say, I didn't want to understand this a kind of abstract way sitting in my apartment in London. I wanted to go and see how this has affected people in the real world and sit with them and try to find those answers. So I ended up spending time with a really broad range of people, from a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to the only person to ever make it out of the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, a hitman, and live to tell what it was like, to the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs with really extraordinary results. And I think the main things I realized were almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Drug addiction isn't what we think it is. The drug war isn't what we think it is. And the alternatives to the drug war aren't what we think they are.
Wow. Okay, so let's then talk about what we know and what we've been taught before we get to the alternatives. I suppose it's about debunking the myths, and you spend a lot of time writing about the causes of addiction, why people become addicted, but you're choosing a different word. You're saying it's not addiction. Tell us about that.
If you'd said to me, addiction is very real, I've seen that in my life, I think there's a different way of thinking about it that might be helpful to people. If you had said to me 4 years ago, say, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were a little bit simple-minded, and I would have said heroin causes heroin addiction. Excuse me, we've been told a story for 100 years that has become part of our common sense, and certainly had with me. We think that if you, me, and the next 20 people to walk past your studio door all used heroin together for 20 days, on day 21 we'd all be heroin addicts, because there's chemical hooks in heroin that our body would start to physically need, and that's what addiction is. The first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about that story, and it puzzled me at first, is when it was explained to me, if you or me after this interview, if we step out onto the street and we're hit by a car and we're taken to hospital, it's very likely we'll be given diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's medical heroin, so it's actually much stronger than the heroin you would ever buy on the streets because it hasn't got all the contaminants that a drug dealer would put in it. You'll be given that diamorphine for quite a long period of time. Anyone listening to this anywhere in the developed world, there are people being given heroin in hospital near you at the moment in large quantities. If what we believe about addiction is right, well, what should happen? Those people should leave hospital, at least some of them, as heroin addicts. That virtually never happens. There's really detailed studies of this. Obviously, my grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip replacement operation. When I learned this, I didn't really know what to do with it. It seemed so odd until I went and interviewed Professor Bruce Alexander in Vancouver, who designed an experiment that's really helped us to understand what addiction is really about. Bruce explained to me the idea of addiction we have comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your listeners can do them at home if they're feeling a bit cruel. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself. So there you go. That's our theory of addiction. It makes total sense. Bruce comes along in the 70s and said, hang on a minute, at his university in Vancouver, he says, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage, it's got nothing else to do, let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park. Rat Park is like heaven for rats. It's a cage where they've got cheese and coloured balls and tunnels and friends, and they can have loads of sex, everything a rat could possibly want in life. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. Mm-hmm. But here's the fascinating thing. Although they all obviously try both the bottles because they don't know what's in them, in Rat Park, the rats don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever use it in a way that looks compulsive. None of them ever overdose. There's many really important human examples about this that I can tell you about in a second. But what Bruce says is this shows us that both the right-wing and left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory is, it's a moral failing, you indulge yourself, it's a kind of hedonism. The left-wing theory is it hijacks your brain, it physically takes you over. What Bruce says is, it's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is to a large degree an adaptation to your environment. And this comes to what you were saying before, really, about bonding. When human beings have an innate need to bond, and when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond with each other, the people around us. Mm-hmm. But when we can't, because we're traumatized or isolated or just beaten down by life, we will bond with something that gives us a sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, but we will bond with something that gives us some sense of pleasure and relief. An interesting human example of this, and there are many, I actually think there's a huge number, but it'll give you a good, clear one. The Vietnam War was happening at the same time as this Rat Park experiment. It's very interesting. Huge numbers, about 20% of American soldiers in Vietnam were using a lot of heroin. And if you look at the studies, the news reports from the time, there's this real panic. Oh, God, that all these soldiers are going to come home and they're going to be hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States, because they believed the old theory of addiction. Actually, this was studied very closely at the time. What happened is they came home and they just stopped. They didn't go to rehab. They didn't.
Because they were in a different environment. That's
exactly. If you're taken out of a hellish, pestilential jungle where you could be killed at any moment and you don't want to be, and you go back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas with your friends and your family, that's the equivalent of being taken out of that first cage and put into the second cage. And this has massive implications obviously for drug policy, but also I think wider implications. Obviously the implications for drug policy are massive. What we do at the moment is we think that the way to stop people being addicts is to make them suffer more and isolate them. I went out in Arizona with a group of women who were made to go out on a chain gang wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict and forced to dig graves. These were broken, traumatized women, and we think that if we traumatize, and then in that prison, I asked to see the solitary confinement unit, which they call the Hole. I was surprised, to be fair to the guards, they did take me and show it to me. There were drug-addicted women who were put in this tiny little concrete cage for a month, and I suddenly thought, this is the closest you could ever get to a literal human recreation of the cages that guaranteed addiction in that first study. So there's partly implications for that, right? It shows that what we're doing now is a disaster. One addiction expert, Gabor Mate, said to me, if you wanted to design a system that made addiction worse, you would design what we have now.
All right, we'll carry on with this in just a moment. Please stay on the line. Very fascinating aspects that I want to explore, especially that example of the Vietnamese War and the addiction that Time magazine reporting that using heroin was as common as chewing gum. And why was it that some 95% of the addicted soldiers, according to the same study, simply stopped and very few had rehab? They shifted from that terrifying cage, you say. We'll talk about this in just a moment. That's Johann Hari, who's a journalist and author of Chasing the Scream, and we are talking about drug addiction. Are we calling it now drug bonding? Should the language itself change, and will that help us understand it better? Johann, can we go to the Vietnam War findings that what's been described as a helpful equivalent was, or rather that experiment, the Vietnam War, which shed light on addiction. Now, the soldiers were placed in an environment where heroin was easily available and they had to cope. And according to your findings, it's not the ones who lacked discipline or had moral failings who became addicted. All of them were, but some, very few of them, needed the therapy intervention.
Well, I think it's about the environment. It's that they didn't, that if you're put in a hellish environment which is unbearable for a human being to be present in, you don't want to be present in your life. And if you go back to your normal life where life is good, you can bear to be present. But the analogy I would use is forget the drug laws, forget drugs for a second, right? I've got in front of me a bottle of water. You've probably got a drink in front of you, right? Totally legally, we could be drinking vodka now, right? You and I could both be drunk. You and I probably both got enough money in the bank that we could be drunk for a whole month if we wanted to be, right? We're not. The reason why we're not is because we've got something we want to be present for in our lives. We've got jobs we love, we've got people we love, we've got things we want to be present for. The same thing is true of all drug use. The main reason why people rely very heavily on drugs is because they can't bear to be present in their lives because they're in a huge amount of pain. And there's a really good example of this in one of the places I went to where they've really, if people who want to understand how to reduce addiction, they've really turned it around in Portugal. It's fascinating, which I can tell you about if you like. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year they tried the American way more. They kind of arrested more people, imprisoned more people, all of that. And every year just the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't carry on like this. Let's set up a scientific panel to figure out what would genuinely solve this problem. So the panel went away for a year and a half, and it came back and it said, decriminalise all drugs from cannabis to crack. But, and this was the crucial second step, take all the money we used to spend on arresting and imprisoning drug addicts and spend it on turning their lives around. And some of that was like rehab and things like that, which were useful. But the biggest part of it was just getting them jobs. If you used to be, say you used to be a mechanic, they would go to a garage when you were ready and they'd say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning that was worth being present for. Wow. And the results have been really incredible. It's been nearly 15 years. Injecting drug use is down by 50% in Portugal. Overall addiction is down, overdose is massively down, HIV transmission among intravenous drug users is massively down. And the way you really know it works is I went and interviewed this guy called João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal, and he led the opposition to the decriminalisation. And he said a lot of the things that a lot of your listeners will totally reasonably be thinking now, which is surely if you decriminalised all drugs, you'd have a massive explosion of drug use and all sorts of problems. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did. And he said that he hoped the whole world followed Portugal's example because it worked so well.
I've got a tweet here, somebody asking, please ask about the mindset that we expect to get addicted to drugs if we try these drugs.
That's an interesting question. Actually, there's a figure that surprised me because the reality of drug use in my life was mostly through my family was addiction. The UN Office of Drug Control, which is the main drug war body in the world who are committed to eradicating drugs, even they admitted a few years ago 90% of all drug use is what they called non-problematic, which means they currently banned drug use, which means it doesn't cause addiction, doesn't cause health problems, doesn't make you overdose. There's a really big, the vast majority of drug use doesn't harm the user, even of drugs that we think of as hard drugs like cocaine. Actually, a very small proportion of cocaine users are harmed. Now, that doesn't mean that the people who are harmed, it's not a tragedy and we don't need to do something to prevent it, because we absolutely do, although what we do now makes it worse, not better. But actually, it's interesting what the tweeter is asking about, because actually, most people who use drugs don't expect to be harmed, and they're right. Most of them aren't harmed by it.
That's very fascinating indeed. I want to go back to that cage that you talked about earlier. We'll do that in just a moment. Just some SMSs coming in on this one. Is this program on drugs going to be podcast? Of course it will be, Anne. Johann, so here's, having listened to you talking about the environment and the bonding, do we then as a response create different types of bonds for people? You made an example that maybe gives someone a job, a sense of worth. But what if some of the drug users do have that? They come from good families, parenting, and all of that. So do we explore a human being's desperate need for bonding, and we create those bonds, and that would automatically ameliorate, or that would prevent the temptation to bond with drugs? I just want to explore that phenomenon. Do you replace one bond with another? We're talking about drugs and really trying to, I hate this expression, but I'm going to use it anyway, think out of the box, fascinated by new findings, a different way of doing things. You don't have to agree with it, but is there a lot of information that we have missed that is worth reconsidering? And my guest says it is now 100 years since drugs were first banned, and all through this long century of waging war on drugs, we've been told a story about addiction by our teachers, by our government, and the story is so deeply ingrained in our minds that we take it for granted. And in his new book, Johann has written Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. It is his attempt, he says, to figure out what is really driving the drug war, and he concludes that almost everything we've been told about addiction is wrong, and he concludes in his book that we don't get addicted to drugs, rather we bond with drugs, and there are various studies that to which he refers to support this point. So Johann, what's this about? We talk about drugs in South Africa. We talk about children who have been neglected. We talk about poverty as being the drivers of drug use. And it would really correlate with what you're saying, because perhaps these young people are desperate for a bond, some sort of bond. So how do we approach it then if we understand addiction to be a bond with drugs? Do you replace it, or do you introduce new bonds, and that would necessarily prevent young people in particular from bonding with drugs?
I think you've put it really well. Bruce Alexander, who designed the rat park experiment we were talking about before, says that in addiction we talk a lot about individual recovery, and that's really important, but we need to think a lot more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And too often we think about addiction, we look at the individual addict in an isolated way, and we look at, whether it's a kid in a slum in KwaZulu-Natal, or actually a rich kid on the Upper East Side of Manhattan whose parents don't give a damn about him and who's just kind of been left to bring himself up in a very different environment. We look at those kids and we say there's something wrong with them. Well, something's gone wrong with the way we treat them, and something's gone wrong with the environment in which they've been raised. And you're right, poverty is part of it, but poverty is not the whole thing. You can be poor and very well bonded and connected with the people around you, and therefore much less likely to become an addict. Or you can be very rich and very disconnected. Now, obviously, if you're poor, it's much more likely your environment is going to be really unpleasant and not a place you can bear to be. So there is some correlation, but it's not like saying poverty causes addiction. That would certainly be wrong. But I think you're right. We need to think much more deeply about how we connect people with sources of meaning, and much more deeply. If you look at, it's not a coincidence that this Scandinavia, for example, has extremely low levels of addiction compared to the United States. Well, what do they do differently in Scandinavia? The main thing is people aren't chronically insecure. They have a good welfare state. They work hard on, people have good relationships with each other because you don't have so much fear and anxiety. You don't have such extreme inequality. These are things that make it hard for people to bond. Now, that requires big changes in a country like mine, Britain. It requires even bigger changes in a country like South Africa. Mm-hmm. And we may be distant from that. But if we want to genuinely understand addiction, I think the other thing is it requires, and this was a challenge to me, it requires people who love addicts, who have an addict in their life, to treat them differently too. Because the temptation is, and it's important to be honest about this, like anyone who loves an addict is going to be angry with them a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why the debate about the drug war is so charged is because it runs through the hearts of everyone, right? There's a bit of all of us that's a drug warrior that looks at an addict and thinks someone should just stop you. And then there's another bit of us that is compassionate and loving. And I think we're encouraged as a culture to kind of internalize this drug war logic. You're told, if someone in your life is an addict, you should cut them off, you should threaten them, you should tell them that if they don't get completely clean immediately, you won't have anything to do with them. The evidence from all of this new understanding of addiction is that is a disaster. What will help them to come back to you will be loving bonds. Making those bonds, kind of threatening those bonds, is far more likely to send them off in a bad direction than to help them. And that's not easy, but it really helped me when I came back from this long journey, when I was looking at the addicts in my life, to kind of, what I resolved to do is try to love them as unconditionally as I could and to let them know that I would always try to be there for them rather than threatening them.
All right, shall we go to Sean in Greenstone? Good morning to you, Sean.
Hi, Rudy. Great topic that you guys are doing here. I've just always been fascinated by how the most dangerous and most socially effective drug, alcohol, is always somehow excluded from the rest of the drugs. I guarantee most people, they always say how weed's the gateway drug, but I guarantee you 99% of people's first interaction with that drug is alcohol. We like to not associate it as a drug, but at the end of the day it is. And there was even a post on a blog on the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago, where these studies come out every few years, and alcohol is always at the top of the most dangerous and the most socially effects on the society. It always beats heroin, it always beats cocaine and all those other drugs. And I think maybe it's got to do with the amount of people that are using it, but I'm just fascinated how we somehow disassociate alcohol with the rest of the drugs, as if this drug's fine. Everyone can do that as much as you want of it, and you can joke about it the next day. But yet the rest of the drugs, no, you can't do. Even something as harmless as marijuana. I mean, it's quite frightening that people have these stigmas and these things in place, but they don't actually have any evidence or any thought process behind why do we actually treat things like this. It's always strange. I hear John Robbie even saying, how he loves to have his drink and all that. I mean, that's as bad as anybody other drug addict saying, I love to get trashed, you know. And I just think we won't tackle this problem with addiction and self-abuse and the problems within society until we take on alcohol. And it's just too powerful, the lobby groups, and it's so entrenched within society that nothing will ever get alcohol into the legal realm. And I think if we really are going to make everything illegal and tackle addiction, then we've got to ban everything, or we've got to make everything legal. This half approach is what gets us to where we are today.
All right, so ban alcohol, as Sean is suggesting, but raising an important aspect of this, whether we talk about it from the perspective of the link between the drugs and the alcohol in your experiments, Johann, or alcohol as a standalone substance that people get or people bond with.
Well, Sean raises hugely important points. Alcohol is exactly right. And it's just to answer one of the things that Sean raised, it's not just that alcohol... So some people think, well, alcohol is more harmful because far more people use alcohol. But actually, per person who uses alcohol, alcohol is more harmful. I'll give you just one figure. For every 100,000 people who use alcohol, 650 die. For cocaine, for every 100,000 people who use it, 4 of them die. So per user, cocaine is far less dangerous than alcohol. That's not a pro-cocaine argument or a pro-alcohol argument. I actually don't like either of them and don't use either of them. But I think that helps to think about it. I think there's two other quick things I would say about what Sean said. One is, one thing that's very interesting and a real implication of what he says. When a drug is look at marijuana, for example. In California, they effectively legalized marijuana. They legalized medical marijuana, but all you had to do was go to the doctor and say you had a bad back, and they would give you a card where you could buy it. And one of the fascinating results is there was a really significant transfer from people using alcohol to using marijuana. There's all sorts of ways we know that. And one of the things that tends to happen when you legalize a drug is lots of people transfer from using alcohol to using this other drug. And the fact that alcohol is the most harmful, that tells us something important. The other thing that Sean asked that I think is super important is, why was alcohol kept legal when these other things were banned? And a big part of my book, Chasing the Scream, is about the origins of the drug war and the story of why drugs were banned. And it's fascinating. If you had asked me at the start why were drugs banned, I would have thought it was for the reasons that we would give now. You don't want kids to use, you don't want people to become addicted, the official reasons. That barely came up. It was banned in America and in Britain in a complete race panic. Cocaine and heroin were associated with African Americans and Chinese people, wrongly associated with them, and they banned them to kind of put African Americans and Chinese Americans back in their place. I tell the story of this mainly through the story of how Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, was stalked and killed by the founder of the war on drugs. But I think that's a hugely important element. They were not banned because they were more dangerous. They were banned because they were associated with despised racial groups.
Whoa, my head is reeling and spinning from that, Johann. Really, really is. I need to reflect on that. Vareshni asks on Twitter, given our terrible socio-economic environment, won't wider drug availability lead to those down and out choosing it as a bond, in inverted commas? Yeah.
This is a really important question, and I would say several things about it. Firstly, what we have at the moment is a situation that makes addiction worse. When you punish addicts and isolate them more and give them criminal records so they can't get jobs, their addiction actually gets worse. So the first thing we should do is choose a policy that's not making addiction worse, at the very least. The other thing that's important is actually, so legalization means different things for different drugs, and it's very important to understand nothing in my book is abstract. I'm not talking hypothetically. I went to the places where they have tried the different approaches. And sometimes people think legalization means you're just saying anyone should be able to buy anything at any time. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. We already have a system of regulation for different drugs. So, for example, alcohol has licensed hours, you're punished if you sell to children, all of those things. I would extend that form of regulation to marijuana and possibly some party drugs like ecstasy. For something like heroin, that's certainly not the model that you'd want. What you have in Britain, say with sleeping pills, I have to go to the doctor to get sleeping pills. I can't just buy them over the counter. That's what I would do with heroin. That's what they've done in Switzerland, and the results have been extraordinary. They've legalized heroin for addicts in Switzerland. If you're an addict, you go to the doctor will send you to a clinic, and you can go to that clinic every day. Mm-hmm. The results have been incredible. Almost all the addicts have jobs, they have lives, they've turned their lives around. They choose voluntarily to stop the heroin after a while because they just get their lives back together. The crime rate massively fell. I think the figure is a 93% fall in burglary in Geneva because of they prescribed heroin to addicts. So just say one other thing as well, which is about children. Mm-hmm. My book is dedicated to my nephews who are teenagers. I really don't want them to use drugs. And one of the reasons I'm in favour of legalization is precisely because of that. I interviewed a guy called Fred Martins, who was a cop in New Jersey, an undercover cop. And he told me about one time he was staking out, and at the moment he had a kind of epiphany. He was staking out a drug dealer in a car park. Mm-hmm. And a kid came up to him and said, he was in plain clothes, and a kid came up to him and said, "Hey, mister, will you go into that alcohol store and buy me some alcohol because I'm not allowed to go in there?" And he said, no, get out of here. So the kid walked up to the drug dealer and bought the drugs from the drug dealer instead because, of course, drug dealers don't check ID. And Fred suddenly realized, we have a system that makes it easier for kids to get illegal drugs than to get alcohol. This is crazy. And that's why he became in favor of legalization. Legalization puts barriers between people who shouldn't have drugs and the drug that are not currently there. Kids will be less likely to be able to get hold of them if they're legal than if they're in the hands of armed criminal gangs who don't check ID and don't give a damn.
So the, lack of a better word, the reputation that drugs have, that they are illegal, they are bad things, they ruin lives and all of that, you're saying it is what's driving children or the youth towards drugs?
There are real harms caused by drugs, and it would be very foolish to say that's not the case. The question is, why do people choose those harms?
Knowing that they're harmful.
Exactly. And, well, we should remember, for the vast majority of users, they're not harmful. And for the 10% who are harmed, there were underlying factors that were driving them there that were misery and pain. It's not like you have happy, healthy people who suddenly one day choose to go and become heroin addicts or are kind of sucked in some kind of illicit way. If you're in terrible pain, you will not want to be present in your life. You will find a way to not be present in your life. If heroin had never been invented, if cocaine had never been invented, you would find some other way to do that. This has happened in every human society that has ever existed. Ordinary people seek out intoxicants. Miserable people seek out ways to be intoxicated a lot of the time. Now, the way you reduce that, the way there are real places that have reduced that, is you make life more bearable for people. This is not some fancy abstract thing. It's what happened in Portugal, and they had a 50% fall in injecting drug use. We can choose to follow the model that's failed, which has been tried by America for 100 years, or we can choose to follow the model that's succeeded, which is Portugal.
Okay. All right. We'll talk about that. Alex, Lisa, Jackie, I see your calls and I'm going to take them in just a moment. Something standing out from the research by Professor Peter Cohen, whom you quote, that if we can't connect with each other, we will connect with anything we can. And he says we should stop talking about addiction altogether and instead call it bonding. And that's the theme we are exploring this morning. So is this a new theory, a new approach to drugs? And is it being embraced by professionals? Should it be? I'm chatting to Johann Hari, who's joining us from London, journalist and author of Chasing the Scream. And let's go to Jackie in Pinelands. Good morning, Jackie.
Hi, Reedy. Thank
Hi,
you
Jackie.
for your show and this topic particularly. Really, I sort of have listened with much interest to Johann's sharing this morning, and immediately in the beginning I thought, but hang on, this isn't what's happened in my life. Specifically the very generalized rat research. And I have found that the loved ones of mine who have been addicts, alcoholics, etc., that it didn't really matter how much material comfort or even love surrounded them. There was a much deeper pain that had nothing to do with comfort. That was what I assume, and I have to, because maybe I don't want to take responsibility for the environment that in the case as a mother or a wife, the environment that I produced. But I do know that I've accepted through many years of doing very layman research through a group of sharing with friends and relatives, specifically of alcoholics, who've experienced so many different frustrations about there's nothing they can do, what can they do? And I've been a member of Al-Anon, which is for the friends and relatives of alcoholics, and it works on the 12-step program. And for me, it was more about being equipped with tools to deal with this pain that is I'm feeling for a loved one. But letting go with love, I found the only thing that is working now for the most painful effect I've had on my life with Pine Addict. The thing that is working now to actually allow them to feel their pain and not enable by providing accommodation or money. And it's been very painful because I've had to let this person drop to rock bottom. It's extremely painful when a loved one is sleeping in their car and very often doesn't have anything to eat, to not reach out, but every other method has not worked. So for me, I'm just praying, but it seems as if this is working. And I just pray that many people can see that the internal pain of someone who's an addict, as Johann was saying, it can be an addiction to anything. It's an escape for us. It's a way of trying to feel in control, whether it's work or gambling or sex, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. It's that we need something that we can use and take hold of and control. So I'm just praying. I'm going to carry on walking this road. Mm-hmm. And I know in my heart that addiction, specifically alcoholism, eventually, if the person is not recovering, it does lead to death or insanity. And from the time that I accepted, that is possibly where I'm going to have to let that person go.
Johann, what do you say to Jackie? I mean, I'm sure you've heard so many of these stories, and it drives the point home that we're not talking about an academic subject or just theory. We're talking about people's lives.
Well, I feel really moved by what Jackie said, and I think one of the cruelest things we do to addicts and the people who love them is we make them feel that they should be ashamed. And one of the things I thought was really heartbreaking about what you said, Jackie, is when you wondered if you were in some way responsible, and it sounded to me like you felt like you might feel some shame, and I wanted to say you absolutely should not feel ashamed. I can hear the love in what you're saying, and the and as someone who's been in the same situation and faced the same dilemma and also had been helped by Al-Anon, I can hear how much you love your relative, and you should feel very proud of the fact that you're trying to think through the best way to help your relative, and I admire that very much, and I don't think you should feel ashamed at all. I would say, look, it's very difficult to talk about these things, isn't it? And I would say, in terms of the first thing I would say is there anyone listening to this who thinks that we should punish Jackie's relative? Is there anyone listening to this who thinks that would make the situation better? I very much doubt it. Every day, all over the world, that is what we do to addicts. We punish them and we make things worse. I don't want to intrude onto Jackie's situation. I don't know the specific situation with her relative. I totally understand and have been in the position of just thinking, there are times when you love someone who's an addict and it's unbearable. And I completely understand that, and I don't want to intrude onto her situation. What I would say generally is I am wary. I completely understand where it comes from, but I'm very wary of the language that's used sometimes, not all the time, in NA and AA and Al-Anon of kind of, you've got to let people hit rock bottom. Because to me, it's a bit like the drug war logic of saying, well, things have got to get so much worse. Now, there are times when someone, everything you do doesn't seem to help, but I think there's a kind of argument about rock bottom I'm very wary of, which is, because the argument, for people who are not familiar with this, I should explain, the argument for rock bottom is people just need to get worse and worse and worse and then find their lowest point, and then they'll get better. I don't believe that, and I don't think that's worked with the people that I love. I think with deterioration, often what happens when people are, if you leave people to deteriorate, they often just do get worse, and there are points of intervention. I feel very cruel saying this in the context of, because I don't know Jackie's specific situation. It may be that the guy, the relative who she loves and clearly loves very deeply and clearly is doing her best for, is not someone who's amenable to help. So I don't want to say anything that's going to make her feel potentially worse. I just don't know enough about that specific situation. Mm-hmm. What I would say to people generally is the more you, and I say this as someone who, I'm not saying it's any position of superiority. It's incredibly difficult, and I can't do it a lot of the time with the addicts I love. But the more you can make your love unconditional, and the more you can remain present in their lives, and the more that the individual can know that you love them, whether they're using or whether they're not, this understanding of addiction, which has very rigorous scientific backing, I think suggests that is the best way forward. But I'm not going to judge anyone who can't do that, because it's phenomenally difficult. And, of course, with any specific individual, that may not be right. So I just want to say that I admire Jackie and I admire what she's doing.
We've run out of time, but Lisa, I do want to hear from you in Bryanston very quickly, please. Good morning.
Hi, Reedy. Thanks so much for taking my call, and thank you to your guest, and thanks for the conversation. I could relate to so much he was saying. I'm an addict myself. I'm in recovery, but I know a lot of addicts, both in active addiction and recovery. And what you're saying about bonding just instinctively feels true. I've always called it a hole in my soul. I think it's something that any addict can relate to, and it is some sort of lack of capacity to be self-reliant and therefore, or to self-love, and therefore to form meaningful connections with life and other people. It just instinctively felt so right. And I love the word bonding, because that's what it is. It's, and I was brought up in a in a lovely household. I was showered with love and attention. I never wanted for anything. And I think perhaps I was given so much love that I never learned to do that stuff to self-love. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it can be the other side as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, especially the bonding thing, which is the new theme, I suppose, that we are highlighting. I'm going to give you a chance to respond to Lisa, Johann, in just a moment, and give us closing arguments that should look at future approaches to drug war. Johann Hari has been my guest and has kindly given us more time than what we'd asked for, precisely because there's been such great reaction to the conversation. And his new book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. And he has spent about 3.5 years figuring out what really drives the drug war worldwide. From what Lisa was saying, I mean, it looks as if she gained insight into the vacuousness, I suppose, of her life then, much later. And the drug addicts that you spoke to, is that a common story, or do they all, at the time that they are bonding with the drugs, don't have answers as to what's driving this relationship?
Well, That's fascinating. I would say two things. Firstly, anyone who wants any more information about this can go to the book's website, which is chasingthescream.com. The question you asked, it's fascinating. I think of one particular drug addict who's one of the most amazing people I've ever met, and I think his story answers a lot of the themes that have emerged from several of your callers. In the year 2000, there was a homeless street addict in Vancouver called Bud Osborne, and he was watching his friends die all around him. People would use heroin behind dumpsters because the police would arrest them if they saw them, but of course, if you're behind a dumpster and if you're hiding and then you start to overdose, no one sees you, you just die. And Bud thought, well, I can't just watch this happen, I need to do something, but he also thought, I'm a homeless addict, what can I do? And he had a very simple idea. He got together a group of the addicts and he said, why don't we, just between us, no one official, why don't we just patrol the alleyways, and if we spot someone overdosing, we'll call an ambulance. So they started to do this, and quite quickly the death toll started to really significantly fall in that area, which was great. But it also meant the addicts started to think about themselves differently. They started to think, oh, maybe we're not just pieces of rubbish, maybe we can do something. And they set up a group called Vandu, and they found out that in Germany they had opened safe injecting rooms where drug addicts could go and use their drugs and be legally and be watched by doctors. And the death toll had massively fallen. And they thought, right, we've got to have that here. So they started to follow, there had been nothing like it for nearly a century in North America. They started to stalk the mayor of Vancouver, Philip Owen, who was a right-wing businessman who hated drug users. They followed him everywhere he went in public, and they carried a coffin. And the coffin said, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injecting room? And this goes on for years, and they get quite depressed because nothing changes. And one day, Philip Owen just says, who the hell are these people? And he goes and meets loads of drug addicts. And his mind and his heart are totally opened. He says, I had no idea. And he opens the first safe injecting room in North America. And his party, which was a right-wing party, is so horrified they deselect him and he loses his job. But the left-wing party wins and they keep it open. When I went there, it was 10 years on from the opening of the safe injecting room. Deaths from overdose were down by 80%, 80%, and average life expectancy was up by 10 years. And Philip Owen told me that he would sacrifice his entire political career all over again just to do that because he was so proud of it. And Bud Osborne, the homeless street addict who started that uprising, he died last year. And when he died, they sealed off the streets of the downtown east side of Vancouver where he had lived as a homeless person. And they had this incredible memorial service. And there were loads of people in that crowd who knew they were alive because of what he did. So what I would say is if there is anyone listening to this who thinks the way we treat drug addicts and drug users is terrible, but there's nothing we can do about it, you are so much more powerful than you know. It's hard to think of a more powerless person than a homeless street addict. And Bud Osborne started an uprising that has transformed his city and his country. The Supreme Court of Canada has now ruled as a direct result of what he started that drug users have an inalienable right to life, and that includes a safe place to use drugs. They can never take that away now. That was started by one person. He didn't wait for a leader. He didn't wait for permission from anyone. He just started and he achieved something incredible, and anyone listening to this can do the same.
So, final word, I mean, do we follow Portugal's way? Is this, should governments go this route? Because it would mean a radical shift from the conventional approach on drug usage. What was expected to happen in Portugal didn't in fact happen, and addiction has fallen.
Yeah, different places need to experiment differently, and what works in one place will not necessarily work in another. But what we can say for sure is, the one thing you can say for the drug war is we gave it a fair shot. The American government has given it 100 years and $1 trillion, and it's been a disaster by pretty much every measure. One of the things that most struck me, I went to all the countries that have moved beyond the war on drugs, from Uruguay to Portugal to Switzerland, and the thing that most struck me is when you go beyond the drug war, very few people want to go back. You know, that when people look at Colorado and Washington, for example, a year ago they fully legalized marijuana. It's sold like alcohol. 53% of people voted at the time to legalize. Since they've seen it in practice, support has massively increased. I think the most recent figure was 67%. When people, it's totally reasonable to be afraid of the alternatives, but when people see them in practice, they realize that the things they were afraid of don't happen, and that's crucial. And things get better. And
this is not something that you're cooking up. You actually spoke to, is it João Figueira, the country's top drug cop, who was
in Portugal. Yeah, it was the most fascinating conversation I had because, as I think I said before, he, he was the guy who led the opposition to the decriminalisation in Portugal. You know, he was the guy on television warning that it would be a disaster. And when I went and met him, the exact quote is in my book, and people can hear the quotes from him on the website chasingthescream.com. But he said, you know, I think the exact words were, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users because he saw now that they were, you know, that it didn't work and that they were people who needed compassion and love. And if I think about all the people we've heard, you know, who've called in, I think about Lisa or the person, the addict that Jackie loves. You know, does anyone listen to this honestly think that Lisa would be more likely to be in the recovery that she is in now, and hugely to her credit, if we'd put her in prison, if we made it impossible for her to get a job by giving her a criminal record? Does anyone think that would improve her chances? But that's what the laws we have do. They take people whose lives are damaged and they damage them more, and then we're surprised that it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. So in a country like ours, where our often repeated slogan is we need to rid our society of drugs, we need to rid our schools of drugs, we need to rid our communities of drugs, in light of what you've shared with us, how should we coin the phrase now? I'm at a loss.
Well, I would say that we need to have a society where we have liberty for drug users and compassion for drug addicts, and we help addicts to turn their lives around instead of making their lives worse. And, you know, is that so? I think that's actually the instincts of most people. I actually think most people are compassionate towards addicts and don't feel vindictive. I think we've actually travelled a long way. And as for a drug-free country or drug-free, well, look, we can't even keep drugs out of prisons, and we've got an armed perimeter and we pay people to guard it the whole time. The idea that we're going to keep drugs out of our countries is absurd. There has never been a human society where people didn't seek out intoxicants and use them. This is a very deep and natural human impulse. You know, you think about a little kid spins round and round and round to make themselves dizzy, even though they know it'll make them sick. That's the first manifestation of that impulse. This is deep in human beings. Now, children absolutely should be protected from drug use. Their brains are forming. It's very damaging for them to be exposed to drugs. That's essential. We actually have a system now. I'm afraid I haven't looked at the statistics for South Africa, but I know that in the United States, for example, it is easier for children to get marijuana than it is for them to get alcohol, because marijuana is controlled by armed criminal gangs who don't check ID. I know in my nephew, I have teenage nephews. I know that no one in my nephew's school is selling Budweiser or Jack Daniels. And loads of kids are selling weed and pills because we've transferred that to an illegal market which does nothing to protect children. Legalization is a way of regulating drugs. What we have at the moment is a system of anarchy. Unknown criminals sell unknown chemicals to unknown users, all in the dark. That's the disastrous situation we have at the moment. We need to reclaim those drugs from armed criminal gangs. And we haven't talked much about armed criminal gangs, but this is a massive factor in South Africa. When you ban drugs, they don't disappear. They're transferred from doctors and pharmacists to armed criminal gangs. Those armed criminal gangs then cause an enormous amount of violence that has nothing to do with drugs. Think about alcohol, right? When alcohol was banned in the United States, there were violent alcohol dealers who committed an enormous amount of murder. That's what Al Capone was. Where are the violent alcohol dealers in America today? They don't exist. The drinks aisle at Walmart doesn't go and shoot in the face the local liquor store. It doesn't happen, right? The alcohol's the same. What changed are the laws governing alcohol. Exactly the same thing goes for drugs. You get these killings that are described as drug-related killings. They're not drug-related killings. They're not people using drugs and going and killing someone. They're one drug gang killing another drug gang for control of an illegal patch. That doesn't happen in a legal market. If you and me go into your local liquor store and try to steal the alcohol or vodka, they'll just call the police and the police will take us away. They don't need to be intimidating. If we go to your local, say, cocaine dealer and we try to steal their product, obviously they can't ring the police would arrest them. They have to be violent and terrifying. I tell this story in my book, the story of an amazing person I got to know over 3.5 years, a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, who really explained to me the internal drug market. And then I explained it through the story of Rosalio Reta, who was a boy who between the ages of 13 and 17 was a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, the Zetas, and butchered and beheaded about 70 people. He explains how these markets work on the inside, and these are markets that are created by the fact that we've prohibited drugs. if you banned milk and people still wanted milk, you would have violent milk dealers killing each other to get it to market.
I've loved chatting to you, Johann, and thank you for your time.
Oh, I'm so thrilled. Thanks so much for engaging with this so deeply, Rudy. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Johann Hari, journalist and author of Chasing the Scream. And the book is called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. And thank you, all of you, for sharing your stories and your messages.